such terrible thoughts. You'd say that it won't happen, but you said you'd help and you haven't. I've been cutting everyone off, get a head start on my run. I won't be your sheep, your coin, or your son. These are just in the predicates, coherent yet unknown names. Oh, can you put me in codes? 'Cause I was born for this language game. To fall on your side means that I lie. On the other, I would die. I just crucify. I just crucify. I just crucify. I just crucify.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to Apocalypse Here, Christianity You Can Live With, and welcome to our live stream. Thank you all for taking this time out of your day to join us to talk about Paul and prisons. And before I bring in our guest for today, I want to talk a little bit about some of the videos that we have on our channel. For those of you on the stream who may be new, we have a bunch of primer videos. I think we have 8 primer videos on various topics, from Christian truth to the gospel, to rereading Romans 1-3, to a primer on faith and Paul and Torah in Israel. So be sure to check those out as well. I'm drawing on a lot of the work of the guy that we're going to have on today. So you'll get to meet him. And as always, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. And please type your questions in the live chat, and we'll get to those at the end. So I'm going to bring in our guest, Douglas Campbell.
Hey, I'm doing great. How are you guys?
Doing well.
Doing really well. Doing
Yeah,
really
thanks for
well.
joining us.
Oh, you're welcome. I love that title song by Beckett.
Yeah, that's right.
And that was awesome. Were you doing the bass for that, John?
No, so this was a bit before my time. So this album released in May of 2019. So this was actually the month of our wedding.
Oh, yeah.
Was when it was released, and then I joined up a bit after that. I think Ethan is actually in the live chat.
He
So.
is. Yeah, thank you, Ethan. That's Ethan's dulcet tones you're hearing singing the theme song. And if you saw Beckett live in the before times, you would have seen John on the bass line there, and hopefully will again when live music exists. But until then,
I don't think I've been interviewed by people who are so cool before.
Well, you're welcome for that.
Yeah, I feel a little uncomfortable.
it's the blinding cool.
Blinding coolness. Yeah, that's right. So yeah, I guess to start things off, Douglas, why don't you tell the folks a little bit about yourself and what you do? Yeah, just to get us started.
Yeah. Well, I'm an exile in America, teaching at Duke. Been here since 2003. I arrived when John Kerry was trying to unseat George Bush, and I couldn't understand how anybody would vote for George Bush. And after that election, realized how little I understood America. So I'm here. I teach New Testament at Duke. I mainly work on Paul. Married to a fabulous lady, Rachel, who gets me involved with most of the constructive things in my life.
Painted that painting right behind you, right, Jack?
Yeah, it's an old one. That's a picture of the beach house where I used to go.
Oh, cool.
The beach in New Zealand, Whangamata. But the reason I mentioned Rachel is not just because she's important to me in lots of different ways, but it's because she was the one that really got us involved in prison work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So therein lies a tale.
We'll talk about that a bit later, actually, when we get into kind of how you got involved in prison stuff. I was trying to remember how you and I got connected initially.
You probably took his class.
Well, you were assigned as my advisor when I came to Duke, and I think I just followed you around for my 3 years. Probably got a little sick of me by the 6th class that I took with you.
Well, you were one of these interesting students that did all the reading, understood it perfectly, and followed everything in class, but never said a word.
Said nothing in class, yeah. Unless I really had something to say.
Like, he was the silent sphinx-like sage, and then you would do these phenomenal papers. It's like, oh, this guy's brilliant.
I think my very first text to my sister about Jon was actually something similar, something to the effect of, "Oh, this quiet guy in my class wants to go see a movie." And I think what I've learned since about Jon is that people often describe you as quiet, and I don't think of you that way.
No.
It's just in groups you're quiet, but around the house,
constantly
the
talking.
trick is getting you to stop talking.
Yeah.
I'm an introvert.
You talk to the cat a lot.
I do talk to the cat a lot. She is my primary interlocutor. Okay, yeah. So as you mentioned, Douglas, the majority of your work has been, actually, I don't know if you mentioned Paul. The majority of your work has been on the Apostle Paul. You've written The Quest for Paul's Gospel, Deliverance of God, Framing Paul, Paul and Apostle's Journey, and then Pauline Dogmatics, which was released earlier this year. Another big one. And I've actually linked your website in the description of the video that's going to be on YouTube, so people can go there and see links to your work and also some of the other stuff you've got on there.
Right.
So kind of taking us back a bit, how did you get to a point where you realized that you wanted to devote the majority of your life to studying the New Testament? When did that happen for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. It did sort of happen.
Mm-hmm.
I was in grad school in Toronto, and someone had told, I was a very young Christian. I hadn't been a convert for a couple of years. Well, no, a little bit longer, probably 3 or 4 years, but it's still pretty new. And I'm doing master's, PhD in religious studies, trying to kind of drill deep. Someone said, you need to go and study with this famous scholar called Richard Longnecker. So in my second year, I went to his class on Romans. And this was a very famous class. And they would clear the dining hall of chairs and tables and bring in chairs for the class because it was the only room in Wycliffe Hall large enough to hold all the students that wanted to attend. And I sat in the corner, and I just was transfixed by it, really. And I loved him. And I just had a vision of a sort of a sage-like figure standing at the front of the room, talking about Scripture and God in a very compelling way. And I want to be like him. Of course, I've ended up being nothing like him, but that is where it started. Yes, I went back to my advisor after about 2 weeks of Romans, and I said, I'm changing my major, I'm changing my dissertation, I'm changing my supervisor, I'm going to learn Greek, I'm going to write on Romans. So that was a fateful decision because, as you know, I've never managed to escape that decision. I'm now still reading Romans in Greek, trying to figure it out.
That's right. Yeah. So the switch was from, you were doing political philosophy before that? Is that
right?
Yeah,
I was a political philosopher and just starting to delve into theology. I thought I was going to do stuff on political kind of structures in Luther and Hegel and the Lutheran antecedents to Marx, which was an unexplored terrain, mapped very nicely. So I still love all that stuff. I had a fabulous mentor in Toronto called Abe Rothstein, German Jew, Polish Jew, who'd sensed the kind of Jewish and biblical antecedents to revolutionary rhetoric. Very, very interesting stuff. But I did end up deviating into Paul.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, the Rothstein stuff obviously comes up in a lot of the prison issues. That
It does. Yeah, it
Yeah.
does. It's a really useful framework. And, you know, when you're doing good New Testament work, you shouldn't lose your connections with theology and with political philosophy.
Yeah.
Because so much of what I was seeing in the Pauline terrain, where scholars are running around arguing for and against positions, I could recognize as liberals getting twitchy about non-liberal readings of Paul.
Mhm.
I could see that very clearly because I'd been trained to identify figures like John Locke. But what my interlocutors couldn't see, because they hadn't been trained to see it, they just thought that was obvious. Because there's nothing obvious about reading an ancient text. And it's certainly not a good idea to read it like a liberal.
Yeah.
So that stuff has remained helpful to me, I think.
Yeah.
Every reading of the Bible is an ethics and is a politics, as Stanley Harris would say. And so we might as well just be honest about what it is we're involved with, right?
Yeah. So speaking of that connection, how did you get involved in prison work here in the States then?
Yeah, well, that was my wife's fault.
Yeah.
For sure. So I've been reading Paul for 14 years, and I knew he wrote letters in prison, but I had no idea what that meant.
Mm.
And don't get the idea that I decided I needed to go to prison because Paul was in prison. That had nothing to do with it. She got involved with a young guy who was a friend of our son's in high school, and he did one of those terrible things that happens in high school, involving guns and stuff. So he got locked up for a very long time. But Rachel just felt compelled, really, led by the Holy Spirit, to reach out to him and offer him a little bit of support. He's very isolated, very broken down. And he reached out to her by way of response. It was a difficult time in her life. And she very bravely visited him. We knew nothing about the American penal system. We knew nothing about mass incarceration, about access to prisons, how difficult. She's not a family member. She didn't have a passport. She didn't even have a social security number. So how was she supposed to get into a maximum security facility to visit this guy? But she managed to do it. And I thought it was a little crazy. But after a wee while, she drew me in and said, I need you to back me on this to keep our engagements balanced. I don't want them kind of connecting with me too strongly. So I started to go in, and I was pretty horrified by what I found. Pretty shocked how I was treated. Pretty shocked by the punitive and harsh and controlling environment and how he was being perceived and portrayed and treated. And so that piqued my interest. I suddenly started to think, hang on a minute. Prisons are complex ecosystems. And this is where Paul was writing his letters. And he hung out with the people that were in here. I need to revisit this. I need to think about all this again a lot harder than I have been. And so that has opened up a lot of new perspectives to me on what's going on.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the connections that you started to make between Paul and also the sort of prison work that you were starting to do.
Right.
Obviously, you talk a lot about a particular conditional and contractual construal of Paul's gospel, which you're obviously unhappy with. And so are we here at Apocalypse Here. We've put out some videos that have to do with that, some of our primer videos. And you'll often say that this sort of reading has captured Paul's interpretation. And I was wondering if you could kind of walk us through how this contractual reading works, and then also how you make the connection between that and sort of prison stuff.
Right. Yeah, great questions. Yeah, because there's kind of two things going on. Because you go, well, Paul wrote in prison, and that's interesting. And I think there's a summons there as well as a challenge. It's very important. But the thing that really grabbed my attention was the way the reading of Paul, the construction of Paul, the gospel that we get out of Paul, which is usually the gospel we get out of Romans, which is usually the gospel we get out of Romans 1-3 and 1-4, drives directly into a certain kind of harsh law and order theology. It's basically authoritarianism dressed up in theological drag. And this authoritarianism, this law and order gospel, is what undergirds a huge amount of the agenda of the right. And they basically read the Bible through this theological lens, which is attributed to Paul. And I was a little horrified by this. I was already horrified by this reading, and it leads to all sorts of hideous consequences. And I knew already when I came to the States that it does terrible things to Jews. I knew already that if we ever wanted the New Testament to be something that was constructive and inclusive, just in a basic, kind, gentle way, if we were going to read the New Testament inclusively, we had to do something with this reading and its construction of Jews. And I knew it was bound up with natural theology, because I'd learned that from Barth, and I'd learned that from his argument with Brunner, when Barth attacked Brunner for natural theology, which he got from Romans 1:19-20, and missed the fact that he was endorsing Nazism, the rise of Nazis. I knew those things, but I never saw the connections with the politics of authoritarianism and mass incarceration until I came to the States. It was like the scales fell from my eyes. And I thought, this is seriously nasty stuff. And it's rooted in this reading of Paul, which I already had significant misgivings about. So I had to kind of press into that and go, well, okay, what if we don't read Paul through a law and order lens? What if we step back from that whole cultural and political location? What do we see? And lo and behold, we get a different gospel. We get like a God revealed by Jesus Christ. We get a God who's actually kinder and gentler than the one we were taught, with a very different approach to problem solving and responding to harm. We see a restorative God, a reconciling God, a God who was a loving, unconditional parent, not a God who is a mallet swinging, AR-15 toting judge. Right. This is, so the contest, the struggle for the interpretation of Paul mapped very directly onto the cultural war in America.
Can I interrupt really fast, Doug? How do you see this? You've talked a bit about Paul. Can you talk about any other texts in the Bible that you see as being similar battlegrounds about this question?
Yeah, sure. I do think Paul is the key guy. He's the one that kind of gives us the whole system. But a text that well is some of the Thean stuff. Is pretty tough. The Book of Revelation has a very aggressive side to it, which I think does a certain amount of damage. There are little patches in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, where you get a pretty fiery Jesus the Olivet discourse. I think those are the places that do most of the damage.
What about the Old Testament?
Well, this is an interesting one.
It's thorny, I know, but yeah.
But here's the thing about the Old Testament: it's what 4 or 5 times larger than the New Testament, and it's got a tremendous diversity of material. So we're always reading that material through a lens that we've gotten out of the New Testament. So if you go back with the lens that you've gotten from Romans 1-2, all you're going to see is retributive judgment. But actually, large parts of the Tanakh are not retributive. They're very kind, gracious, inclusive. There's a very faithful God. So tons of resources in the Tanakh or the Old Testament for the inclusive, reconciling project. But you can find some tough stuff in there. I mean, if you can find stuff that justifies genocidal activities against villages on the West Bank in the Tanakh. You don't have to look that far.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is obviously just a huge issue with biblicism, is sort of the refusal to either have a lens that or a hermeneutical model that you're going into the text with, or a refusal to admit that you have one, which I think is actually a lot more insidious.
It's the same thing.
Right. It is the same thing. It is the same thing. There's no such thing as a person who really does give equal weight to the entire text.
You're projecting your assumptions on the text, but I'm just reading what's there. Yeah, totally got it. Totally agree. I actually, one of the things that I've learned with this long battle for the interpretation of Paul is just how deeply rooted and just how important these prior categories are. And our New Testament scholars, even the ones that are very, very highly trained, are really bad at acknowledging that they're doing this and actually seeing it at work. So that's really important.
Yeah.
Let's be explicit about our theology. Let's get it out, put it on the desk, and know what it is, right?
Yeah.
Yep, for sure. So you mentioned a few times the law and order construal kind of Paul. Can you give kind of a quick summary of that reading of Paul, the law and order?
Sure. I mean, the key image is God as a retributive judge.
Yeah.
And he's really, the way he relates to you, he's a long way away from you, he's distant from you, and he manages you through laws, and he's a death penalty judge. So if you step out of line, you will receive the death penalty at the end of the age. And this is supposedly a good thing because this is our initial kind of contact with God. And we're supposed to learn from this that we're sinners and we're in trouble, and the anxiety and guilt and horror that's generated, the fear, is meant to propel us towards accepting Christ. And there's a sort of what you realize as you press into this is there's actually a contract operating here. There's an initial contract that you fail, and the negative clause is kind of activated. And then there's an easier Christian contract where you have to do something in order to access the benefits that God's offering. And usually it's faith. They get that from Paul. So you kind of contract into the kingdom of God and into the church. As long as you keep exercising your condition, you'll be okay. But because you contracted into this positive relationship with God, the problem is God doesn't really love you. God has been conditioned into connecting to you. And if you break the condition, God doesn't love you. Now, someone who has to be conditioned into loving you and then who stops loving you when you break the conditions, they don't love you. They're just in a contract. They have affection for you. And that's just not the God revealed by Jesus Christ. And it's not the God that Paul knows who's revealed by Jesus Christ. This is a God who will die for you before you respond. This is a God of limitless, unquantifiable benevolence and commitment to us. I mean, as Paul prays correctly in Ephesians, which he wrote, we need the Holy Spirit to open our minds to understand something which can't be understood, which is the limitless limits of God's love for us. That's not the law and order gospel, is it?
Yeah, right.
It's interesting how much of that hinges on the idea of the crucifixion, because it seems like, the crucifixion has been employed in both directions, right? On one hand, I think that when people do talk about the retribution of, like a retributive God, and like the idea that God is fundamentally retributive, and this is his posture towards humanity, the image that usually gets drawn up is the crucifixion. Look how serious God is about retribution, and that he was willing to torture Jesus for reasons that have to do with you.
What a nice guy.
right. But I think that's, when you take a more Trinitarian approach to this and you think of God as the one on the cross, I think that you open up something really different in who God is, of the God who dies for humanity before they respond, and the God who is in solidarity with humanity before they know about it. It's interesting to me that image is pulled in such different ways. And it seems like, without the Trinitarian idea, you can do a lot of violence to it. And that's, that seems like, I don't know, that's something I was thinking about.
Yeah,
while you're sitting
No,
here.
you're exactly right. You're exactly right. And the word violence is critical.
Yeah.
Because when God comes as a Trinity and a Father offers up a Son for you, and they work together, the violence is done to the Son, really by us.
Yeah.
When you're working with the law and order God, the violence is imported into the very nature of God.
Yeah.
And the Father inflicts violence on his child.
Yeah.
And there is something a bit monstrous about that. But there's an insight here that needs to be captured, which I think the Trinitarian God will capture, which is that there is a judgment.
Yeah, absolutely.
God takes sin with the utmost seriousness, and the judgment ultimately is that we must perish. We must die, and our sinful situation must be terminated.
Mm-hmm.
It's terminated because it's intrinsically contaminated. It's not because God terminates it with an act of violence on his own part. So this is a subtle but critical distinction in how we handle things. Yeah, God takes sin seriously enough to enter into a sinful condition and terminate it.
Yeah.
And we can't let go of that. But he doesn't actually attack it aggressively and inflict pain on it to make it go away. That's the big mistake.
Right. And those of you who have watched a few of my videos have heard me talk for a couple of hours on just what
you're an expert on this.
Yeah, back. So you mentioned the sort of with the conditional contractual gospel that God has to be conditioned into loving you, which isn't love at all, right? Mm-hmm. It's interesting how lots of people don't get that point fundamentally. And it's fascinating because when we talk about love, like 99% of the time in just everyday life, we're not talking about that harsh conditional contractual gospel. Right. But for some reason, it works for God for a lot of Christians. And there seems to be kind of an equivocation there, right? And it's always struck me as weird that stuff is fine for God, where God can be this harsh sort of retributive God and somehow still be loving, even though when we talk about love most of the time, we're not talking about that. We're talking about unconditionality and relationality, really.
Yeah, totally. Well, he loves me, but he's hard and retributive all those other folks.
On the others, right. So that's where the othering kind of
it's an othering operation. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. It's a paradox. One way of connecting with people on this issue is to ask about parenting. If you've got people that have got kids, most parents are going to go, when I sit down and think about it, I've got a son, I've got a daughter, there's not anything I can do or they can do that's going to alter this relationship. We're stuck with each other forever, as son and daughter to father, but that's a good thing. That is a good thing, despite what they say about me sometimes. I think that's something
right.
And I think deep down, despite all the mixed messaging and the kind of inadequacies of my parenting, they have heard that I will always be there for them, and hopefully they will always be there for their kids too. This is how it's meant to be. It's so tragic what when you talk about our inability to receive this message that God really loves us. There's often a psychological barrier there because we have ourselves experienced rejection and pain, often from people who should have been committed to us, and this gets in the way. We don't love ourselves. We don't believe. We perhaps haven't received covenantal love from somebody, like my wife. She wouldn't mind me sharing this, but she came from such a horrifically toxic and abusive environment that it probably took her 20 years of hard spiritual work to finally reach the point where she could think of God as a loving parent. And she would say freely, I'm there now, but what was getting in the way of that was I couldn't accept that about myself.
No,
maybe that's the bad. Maybe Americans don't love themselves deep down.
Well, I kind of wonder if there's sort of a reciprocal cycle in a lot of ways, that people have this, authoritarian contractual religion preached to them, and then they model that to their children, and then their children have that trauma, and then they put that back on God. I mean, the thing that immediately came to mind while we're sitting here talking is the it's the hellscape of Twitter. That's people on the more conservative end posting pictures of Joe Biden like embracing and kissing his son and like calling him beautiful and being like, is this really an appropriate relationship for a father to have with his son? Like, Yes, it is horrifying that, you know, like I have my issues with Biden. Like, this is not a referendum on his policy, but you know, the fact that for so many people in the States, the image of a father embracing his son is disturbing. Like, we don't have a category for that. And that is, and I think there has to be some back and forth there, you know, that if you're raised in this very handoff, you know, and there's some masculinity issues going on there,
No, I think you're exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
You're exactly right. God has to break through our distorting categories. And big time. Because I mean, there's that famous picture by Rembrandt of the Return of the Prodigal Son, right? In which the father embraces and loves the son and refuses to accept his own definition of himself as a servant.
Yeah.
He says, no, despite everything you've done, you're still my son. That the heart of the gospel would be rejected and mocked and vilified on Twitterscape. I'm really troubled by this now. I'm going to have a timeout. Think about it.
Yeah, definitely don't go on Twitter to.
Yeah, don't do that. Don't do that. Do this in the privacy of your own home.
But yeah, let's talk more about some positive stuff. If you could, so you laid out kind of the Law and Order approach to Paul. Can you give us just a short summary of the good reading of Paul?
The good stuff. The good stuff. Yes, with pleasure.
Yeah,
with pleasure. Well, the problem with the good stuff is it is hard to believe if you don't believe that God is real and God is breaking into your life in a real and active and profound way. But Paul did, and I do too. And really, what he's saying is there's a sense in which we have all been joined by the Holy Spirit to the death and resurrection of Christ in a real way. So there's a sense in which the evil, the corruption, the struggle has been terminated, and we've stepped through into a new existence, which has been set free. Now, Paul knows we're not fully there yet. We've got sort of 1 foot in the muck and the mire, but we're on the front foot as well. We possess a new mind. Instead of a mind of conflict and strain and struggle, it is a mind characterized by peace, which is a tremendous gift from the Holy Spirit. So we're literally tasting the resurrection. That's the good news. It's a gift. We don't have to do anything to receive it. We are asked to respond to it and to move forward in this reality. But that basically is what Paul announces. And his good news was, A, the Lord has come, taken on our condition, died, resurrected, remade us. B, you don't have to be a Jew. This is for the Jews. But everybody can be part of this party. Yay. Wake up and smell the coffee. That was it. That's the last bit was my line that I got from Jeff McSwain, but this is basically where he goes.
Yeah. So how does this gospel that you just laid out, this really wonderful gospel of God's love, God entering into our human condition lovingly and terminating it on the cross and then being resurrected, and we're participants in that by way of the Spirit. How does this gospel help us address the current prison problem and how we might offer sort of different ways of addressing harm and conflict and wrongdoing, really? About that?
Great question. It gives us a several different clues about how to kind of pick this problem apart. I think the first thing it wants us to say is when we're rebuilt and brought into a relational community where relationships are functioning the way they should. We're designed to be relational entities, relational beings, and these relationships are meant to function in a certain way. So when an act of harm has taken place, the kind of fabric of our relationality, the delicate web in which we all live and move and have our being, it's been torn and ruptured in lots of different directions. And if you want to get back to a place of healing and restoration, you've got to restitch these little relationships thread by thread and piece by piece. So everybody who's been hurt has to be brought in and brought back into some sort of relationship. So this is what a restorative justice process would look like, where you set up conversations in circles very carefully, so everybody who's been involved can talk about what they've been through and how it's impacted them, and thereby begin to move beyond it. And this is a very different approach to dealing with harm from punitive responses. Punitive responses say, hey, we've got a bad situation here. I'm going to inflict more pain on it, and this will solve it. This doubles down on the destruction. So you've got someone who's been victimized with all their torn and broken relationships, and you've got a perpetrator, and now you're going to destroy and break all their relationships. So I think that's the first thing that we do. The second thing we learn is that no one is irredeemable. Christ has reached everybody. He's gone into the very depths of the human condition. He's died as a criminal, naked, tortured, ashamed, publicly. So he's in the prisons, listening to and walking alongside every single person that is in one of those facilities. And his purpose for them, he wills the good. He does not will to harm them. He wills their good too. He wants to see them become better people. Every one of those people, Jesus says, to quote Brian Stevenson, is better, more important, more precious than the worst thing they've ever done. Mm-hmm. And this, again, our prisons should not be places of punitive action. They should be places of transformation. They should also protect us. We do, I think, have a right to be protected from harm, from people who will damage us. That's fine. But protecting people is a much lower threshold kind of activity than actually going out, grabbing them and inflicting pain on them and punishment. It's a much lower threshold for police and prison activity. But I don't want to, from my point of view, where I'm sitting, God doesn't just say, hey, just get rid of everything. Get rid of the police, get rid of prisons. I've solved all of this. I don't think that's true. He says, set these things up and modify them and reform them so that they reflect basic gospel principles. Yeah, which is a heavy lift, but other countries have done it. Yeah. And even countries that don't believe in God. Yeah.
Right. Especially those countries.
It's the country that believes in God that's dragging its feet. Figure that out.
Yeah. So you mentioned circles in there when you were talking. Can you explain circle processes, just for people who don't know what they are, just how they work, what sort of benefits you see in them, and also some experiences you've had involved in circle processes that have been powerful.
Yeah. Great question. So this is a technique that people working on family dysfunction, substance abuse, and stuff up in Canada discovered that Indigenous people were using, and other Indigenous people do it as well. And it's a very simple process where you sit in a circle with the talking piece, and it's got to be ideally sacred, eagle feather, and you pass this around, and you first of all you build a sense of community and solidarity. What holds you together? You only speak when you get this, when you've got the talking piece. You don't speak otherwise. And if you do want to speak when you're holding it, you speak your truth. You speak what comes out of you, your story. And you don't comment and judge and give people reading lists and tell other people what to do. It's just coming from where you're coming. Now, you might have to sit there for a long time and let the eagle feather go past you until you're ready to talk. But when you're ready to talk, you unload. And what happens is fascinating. As people get in touch with what they feel, circles actually take on a life of their own and kind of build a healing consensus. It's quite fascinating, and you have to kind of experience one to know what I'm talking about. But they can solve a lot of problems. They can process an awful lot of harm. An example of that would be a lovely young Christian guy I knew in a circle for a long time without saying a word. I'm talking weeks and months.
That sounds like me.
This could be the move for you, John. I hope you wouldn't mind me saying this. And everybody, we talk a lot about race in our circle because it comes up a lot because there's a lot of pain. There's a lot of pain. And how do we respond to this? And we obviously African American people are saying certain things, and white people are saying certain things. But how do you move forward? How do you move forward until you're allowed to tell your own story? So we've got a guy sitting there. He's a foreigner, but he's white. And it turns out that he had a narrative of awful racial pain. As somebody who was white from a colonial country, where the English had come and imprisoned his grandparents, and they had died in some of the first concentration camps. And this was the pain that he was carrying in all the kind of US conversations and contexts. And how could he engage with what people were saying here when he's bringing in that story and he's being told here, hey, you're a white racist supremacist. You've never been anything but someone who's benefited from being white, when it wasn't true. There was an awful, awful background history of tragedy there. Well, anyway, the circle allowed this to emerge, and a really palpable act of healing to take place. So yeah, that would just be that sort of high-end example, but
yeah.
Can I interrupt really fast? I know not everyone who watches this show is religious. So have you seen this be effective with like mixed religious groups? Like
very much so. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Very much so. It's not a Christian technique.
Right, I didn't think so. Yeah.
Yeah, it's something the indigenous people do, and they know how to do it. You don't have to teach them.
Yeah.
They process their stuff this way, and it's really a very, very effective way of processing things. Yeah, I would recommend it for anything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So just to kind of back up a little bit, I have a kind of more general question that will kind of get us into a little bit more of the practical realities of like visiting a prison, which I think would be good to talk about.
Yeah.
So a lot of your kind of theological and biblical work has an eye toward the practical, everyday Christian life, even beyond prisons. Why is it so important? And you alluded to this quite early on when we were talking. Why is it important that academic work in the New Testament and theology actually has legs on the ground? Why not just say like the academy and the church are just two kind of domains? Distinct from one another? Yeah. So why is that important?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. Well, it depends if you think that the Bible's got anything to do with God. There's different places that you can read it, and
living God, right?
Exactly. And ultimately, I'm not interested in the Bible for its own sake. Yeah, it just does not interest me. That would be an antiquarian project if we were just reading the Bible and reconstructing what it was doing. It's like, oh, look how these people 2,000 years ago thought about things. Well, which is fun. I mean, but you might as well go and read Plato or Philo or something like that. I think for me, the Bible is part of my tradition, my community. And so it's something that I was taught very early on in that tradition that is quite dynamic and active. Now, it's not dynamic and active in the way that I thought. It's not a magic book. You've got to work very hard sometimes to be shaped by it. And it's not enough just to read it. And you've got to be embedding what it says in communities of people that are working on their stuff, often in circles, trying to put these things into action. But I think as part of that process, it's exciting.
Yeah.
I think once it's something that God is using to reach into the world in a transformational way, that's the stuff of life. Yeah. That's what life is all about. That is exciting and gripping. That's really what I want my life to be all about.
Yeah.
So there we are.
Yeah. So this semester, you're teaching at Duke the kind of big core course for the prison ministry certificate, and I'm serving as your faithful teaching assistant for that.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, you're welcome. Shameless plug for what I'm doing for you.
You can hire Jon too.
I appreciate it. No, I really appreciate it.
No, of course.
Yeah.
Obviously, this year we're not going to be able to do any visits to prisons and to facilities like we normally do, which is a shame. We've been trying to kind of supplement that with guest speakers and also some documentaries and stuff like that. So in the past, and I took your course back, I think in 2014, which has been a while ago. So what are some specific responses you've seen from students when they step into that situation for the first time?
Great question.
For you.
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I mean, as we've been saying, there is this kind of harsh side to the States, and a lot of the population thinks, do the crime, do the time. Let's lock them up, throw away the key, that kind of stuff. But we're not really connected to what that does to other human beings. And it can be quite cruel. And you can't talk people out of this. What you have to do is you got to get them face to face. So the only thing you can do here is get people inside a prison and see hundreds of faces against the pod wall, and the pain and the restriction and the squalor that we are inflicting on them in the name of justice. And at that moment, you connect in a visceral way with the harm that we're doing. And you look at these people and you just can't categorize them as animals out there, you're face to face, they're just like you and me. They say, what the hell are we doing here?
Mm-hmm.
So there's not really any substitute for getting people face to face, getting their bodies inside of prisons. And I think I wish that for every year that a politician wants to add on to sentencing measures, they have to spend a day in prison.
Mm-hmm.
You want to up it by 25 years, you have to spend 25 days in prison. And I promise you, our sentencing guidelines will be drastically altered overnight.
Mm-hmm.
Just a day in a prison. And people would start connecting with what the damage we're doing to people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's expensive, it's unnecessary, it's nasty.
Yeah. So what are some common mistakes that you see people making when they maybe enter a prison for the first time, or just continue to do when they're entering prisons? What are some real common ones that you see?
Yeah, and that's very important.
Yeah,
too.
the posture.
There's a danger with visiting a prison that you sort of treat it like a trip to the zoo.
Yeah, right.
Oh, I'm here to look at the animals and just, look. Like you treat it like a tourist. And I don't think that's a good thing. I think we need to be respectful of the fact that we're actually intruding on a place where a large number of people live who've had a lot of dignity and control.
Yeah. If I could jump in here real quick, the point about the zoo thing, it's also hard not to do that because prisons are set up in kind of that way when you're visiting them. I remember when we visited Wake back in 2014, I remember walking through this, what seemed like a kind of, how when you go to a zoo, there's this sort of like bubble of that's separating you from the animals who are in cages. It felt like that. Like the feeling of going in there was that they're on display for you to watch, right? Yeah. So it's set up in that kind of way already. So it's understandable that it's hard kind of not to do that.
Yeah. Panopticon.
But then you realize these are people that are behind that. Yeah. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's the architecture is based on surveillance.
It's crazy.
And where it's not, it's based on isolation.
Yes.
Which goes right back to the inception of the prison, where the Puritans thought that since you'd done something wrong, the best thing for you was to isolate you and let God get to work on you. You would pray and pray and pray and pray, and then the the divine light would illuminate your heart, and you would repent and come out a new and changed person. And that was best done alone. So unfortunately,
it's a crazy understanding of the self too. The idea of like,
yeah. I mean, it's wrong. For all the
right. Like the idea that people are more authentic by themselves than they are in
radically individualistic approach to theology, and just a disaster. Yeah, a disaster. So you end up isolating people from one another. When one of the things that a lot of people in prison struggle with, they're very dysregulated. They often have real struggles with self-control and anger and stuff like that, and often terrible anxiety and panic is brought on by isolation. So they become less regulated and more angry and more upset if they're actually set apart from other people. I mean, it's a vicious circle. It shows you you can pursue theology and its political consequences with the very best of intentions, and as Dante said, end up paving the road to hell. Hopefully we're not doing that, but that's where I start heading. You guys are here to help me out.
So you mentioned not approaching prisons like a zoo, and then I interrupted you. Do you have any other sorts of advice for people who
or how to talk to prisoners? Honestly,
also great question.
There are so many correspondence groups that help set people up with prison pen pals if you want to like provide companionship for somebody. Like how do you talk to prisoners?
Well, I think yoke fellows have a good model.
They
do it properly. And the idea, I think, is to not patronize the people you're visiting at first. Don't go in there to help them or to save them. A lot of them are actually saved already. There is a church inside already. There are a lot of Christians doing time. And they don't need you to arrive and tell them that they've screwed up. They think they beat themselves up with that narrative every night. They need you to arrive and say, God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. And even if you don't believe that, I do. But I would get in there and I would try and find someone who's an experienced visitor who has learned how to treat people during time in a normal way. And they've got through the awkwardness, they've got through the difficulty, and they've actually just reached that point where they dignify the people they're with by treating them as equals. And people doing time will pick up on this in a microsecond if you're patronizing them or looking down on them. They won't stop the visit because they're so bored. They want people to visit, but you won't necessarily really get into kind of authentic relationships with them. I would try and apprentice myself to someone who knows what they're doing and copy them and get comfortable and pursue that place of treating someone like an equal, if you can. It's really, really hard. Doesn't just apply to people doing time. I mean, it applies to all sorts of people, different constituencies. But it is the key, I think, to authentic Christian proclamation. I'm theorizing here. Don't think I've got it all figured out. I'm on my way.
I think
I'm on the journey.
I think something I would add would be if you're planning on visiting a prison, I would try to make it a fairly regular thing if you can, and not just do one visit and just be like, okay.
That's generally a good idea
just in terms of forming relationships with people. You can't really get to know somebody talking to them one time. This has to be something sustained over a long period of time, really.
I think it's a calling.
That's another thing.
I don't think everybody's called to visit prisons, but if you are, it really is an incredibly enriching journey. It's a really enriching place to do work, to meet people, to have friends. It's fascinating how much texture it adds to your life. People doing time, they've got really interesting stories. And there are really good qualities in some. Not just the people doing time. There's a whole facility there with a whole group of staff who are underpaid, overworked, highly stressed, and many of them are kind, and they need our support as well. Correctional officers have a really, really tough job. It doesn't. It's not helping anybody if we're making correctional officers have a miserable time.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much, as we were really learning in class yesterday, was it? Or 2 days ago, and also when Peter Coons came, there was a lot of trauma there for people who were employed, especially CEOs. And
prisons are designed to traumatize you.
Yeah.
And they traumatize everybody. And this is something we pay a horribly high price for.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the good news is that God cares about this.
Yeah.
And wants us to engage with it and can heal it. But on the other hand, we got to kind of get off our butts and get into the spaces that we might be a little afraid of, where God is actually calling us to get to work.
Yep, absolutely. So I just have one more question for you, and then we've got some questions in the chat as well. But my last question is just, what are some resources that you would point people toward, some basic resources to learn more about the prison system and its history for people who just don't know much about that? Where would your sort of go-to texts or videos, documentaries? Where would you go for that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I haven't written my book on this yet, so I'm
forthcoming.
But I would start with Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, and it really is a marvelous book. It's not entirely correct. It's correct in what it affirms and wrong in what it denies. But it just is such an education, not just into prison dynamics, but the legal system and race. I think it's a prophetic text. I would read Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy. If you really want to know how justice works for Black people, especially in the South, that is a gripping story. I would also read the local book called The Best of Enemies, about the local friendship between, this is a little different, but it's about a friendship in Durham between Osher Gray Davidson and I think his name was Stead, the local leader of the KKK. And they met in court, in a court battle over school districting and whatnot, schools and whatnot. And they became very, very close friends. And it just is an insight into the way God breaks down barriers and converts people. The Best of Enemies, it's called. There's a documentary based on New Jim Crow called 13th, won the Oscar for that documentary. Again, it's a great education. It's a little one-sided, but hey.
It's a start. Yeah.
Can I make a recommendation? Actually, have you guys seen The House I Live In?
It's very good.
Yeah. I saw that right around when I read New Jim Crow, and I saw this in I was in my early 20s, and I had come from extremely white context where we never talked about any of this. And for me, that one was really helpful just for me to understand. I'm embarrassed to admit it, but it's true. Why should I care? Why should I care that drug dealers suffer in prison forever? And it made me really think carefully about what drugs do we think are wrong, and why do we think they're wrong, and how much of that is tied up in racial connotations with different substances, and how drugs that are favored by white people will never put you in prison. But
no, exactly. Yeah, it's good. It is good. That's a good recommendation, Laura. I've had a few further thoughts here. There's a documentary called Rikers Island, America's Prison. I think is that a PBS or an NBC or something?
I think it's PBS. Rikers Island. Yeah, it's that. What's the series called?
It's Bill Moyer.
Yeah,
Bill Moyer does the interviews. That's the best thing I've seen on what it's actually like to be in a prison, because all the guys are just telling you. There's also a very, very good documentary called The Sentence by Rudy Valdez. And it's about his sister and her incarceration and what the impact on the children, the family, the husband. That's a very, very good documentary, tracking through the pardoning process that took place under the Obama presidency. Check that out. These all have trigger warnings. They're all hard to watch. They all have violence or tales of violence, sadly. The Stanford Prison Experiment as a movie based on documentary footage. That's an interesting insight into how prison authority can go wrong. And it's a really good movie, and it's very faithful to what actually happened in this notorious experiment. Yeah, so those would be a couple more that I would definitely watch. But videos and movies are the way into this. Because you really feel the pain.
Yeah.
There's a Just Mercy movie that just came out last year. I haven't seen it yet, but I know my sister said it was incredible. So,
and you know, Dead Man Walking.
Oh yeah,
is a phenomenal movie. It's a phenomenal movie. It raises a lot of the issues in a very profound way.
Yeah. So I'll actually once we finish the stream, I'll add those resources to the description too, for people who didn't get to watch this live. So I'll put that kind of in a little bibliography as well.
Right.
We have a few questions. What's that?
Did I leave any of the key movies out? Because I know we've watched a lot in class.
No, I think those are the key ones for sure. Have you got a few questions from the chat?
Did you want me to look at the chat?
I've got it up. Can you see it on the screen? So this is from Spartan Theology, a good buddy of mine. Many people use the Hebrew Bible to create a case supporting the death penalty. What is your opinion on this? And then he followed this up with, how do you think Paul would have thought about this?
Yeah. Well, these guys lived a long time ago, and this is analogous to the slavery question. Where culturally embedded practices have been very, very slowly disclosed and revealed by the church to be wrong. But it took a heck of a long time for us to figure that out. And the pressure on these cultural practices like slavery comes from good Christian theology, where everybody's made in the image of God. And we just have trouble extending that dignity to everybody. So finally, when we figure out that black people that we've enslaved in Africa are human beings, it's like, well, we can't really own them anymore, can we? Or degrade them. It just takes a long time to admit this stuff. So where I'm going with this is I would argue that, the Bible is entirely comfortable with genocide, with the death penalty, with slavery, with polygamy, with harems, with vicious dynastic disputes.
Right.
There's quite a bit that the Tanakh is comfortable with that we would now say is not acceptable. But the key point would be, in the light of Jesus Christ, we've made a case for this. We've made a case for slavery being wrong. We've made a case for the subjugation of women being wrong. We've made a case for the death penalty being wrong. So the Hebrew Bible and Paul probably both quite comfortable with the death penalty. Does that make it right? I don't think so.
Can I chime in really fast here? I mean, I also think it's worth noting that even by Paul's day, a lot of the more violent retributive aspects of Torah had been retired, and Jewish interpreters had already made moves on that. So the classic example of this is like the eye for an eye idea. Right. Like when you look at Hammurabi, that is very literally intended, and there's at least some indications that the authors of the Hebrew Bible thought that that's similar. If you cut someone's arm off, then you get your arm cut off, or if you kill someone's son, your son gets killed. And in the Hebrew Bible, I don't think ever has that explicitly, but you still have this, the very physical, literalized retributive principle. Whereas by Paul's day, on one hand, the Romans have superseded the right to the death penalty, so the Hebrews don't have it anyways. It doesn't matter, and also all of this has turned into commensurate monetary damages. So I think you already, without any Christian influence at all, without there's already, Jewish readers of their own scriptures who are making humanizing moves here. And I just want to give them adequate credit for that. So
yeah, for sure.
This question raises just a crucial piece of our discussion there, doesn't it? Which is our politics. Deriving our politics out of the heart of the gospel is so hard to do. It's so hard to do.
Yeah,
and
it
it's
relates
so important.
it relates to the conception of what the Bible is as well, right?
Right.
If you're running with this sort of like hard inerrancy model
Yeah.
and trying to sort of live your life in the light of every single thing that's going on in the Bible, even that's not really possible. I
Well, it's
think
not. I don't think it's what the church's Bible.
no, yeah, not at all.
Well, Jesus said in every gospel at some point, you need to understand that the scriptures are about me.
Yeah, right. Which is kind of important. Yeah. So next question is from Carlos M. And you're going to have a lot to say about this, I'm sure. Doug, what is the proper conception of Paul's view regarding God's justice or righteousness?
And righteousness. Yeah.
I did make a few videos on this.
No, it's pretty straightforward, actually, for me. The rightness that is the heart of God that gets revealed is a kindness and a goodness and a mercy. That's what's right, to act always in that fashion. When we read about God's righteousness or God's justice in translation, we're translating the Greek word dikaiosune thai, or dikaiosune thau, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And I would be pretty strongly committed to the idea that Paul is quoting a strand from the Tanakh, in the Psalms particularly, but also Deuteronomy, Isaiah, where that phrase refers to a king who is setting his people free and liberating them. So the right thing to do if you're a king and your people are in trouble and struggling, is the right thing to do is to do something like the Exodus. You set them free from their struggle. And this is, so God's justice and righteousness is actually God's liberation of us, which is the right thing for a loving God to do. So,
the right thing isn't to crucify your son? That's crazy.
Right.
Yeah, no, I'm moving beyond that. Good question. Very good question. It opens up some critical issues.
The Deliverance of God, which sounds like a good book title.
Yeah.
Someone to take that.
That's right. Yeah, so I actually talk about this quite a bit. The Paul's use of the psalmic material, the kingly kind of narrative coming out of that Paul's pulling through into his words. In a primer video we did on God's solution in our gospel series, I talk quite a bit about that and understanding sort of just and righteousness words, and also justification kind of in this liberative way as well. So check that out. I may have to link that in the description too for people who want to kind of dive into this.
Good stuff.
Yeah,
it's good stuff and it's important. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for doing that.
You bet. Okay. Dr. Campbell, are you a believer in apokatastasis, like another former Duke prof, David Bentley Hart?
Kind of.
Yeah.
DBH. Yes. Yeah, I'm kind of firming up on this one. DBH is more into sort of Greek Orthodox metaphysics than I am, and he knows more about the fathers than I ever will. And apokatastasis is something that Origen is strongly committed to, and I wouldn't be committed to everything that Origen says. Nevertheless, it does say in places like Colossians, tapanta, everything gets created, redeemed through Christ. So I want to take that very seriously, and I think, I'm a kind of a reluctant universalist. I don't know good reasons not to be one. I think that when you're taking your departure point from Christ, and I'm really kind of pissed about it, because there are people that I want desperately not to be in heaven. I don't want.
Yeah, we were just talking about this the other day.
There are conversations I do not want to have. There are people I absolutely do not want to be there.
Absolutely.
I'm serious.
No, I'm the reason I'm laughing is because I feel that.
Sure. But I honestly think, damn it, they will be there, which does actually put pressure on me to get organized and get. I mean, I'm not worried about the great villains of history. They can go off and talk to people they need to. I'm talking about people in my family.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
At work.
Right.
But I don't want to be in heaven.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Good
Great
stuff.
question, though. Appreciate it.
I think my position is a little bit stronger on universalism. I'm pretty straightforwardly committed to that because I think that that's really what's revealed in Jesus ultimately, is that all things are made. What's that?
Did I say I wasn't strongly
Oh,
committed?
no, not quite.
I was very,
all the other doors were closed. So.
I was referring to my reluctance to emotionally to endorse it.
Oh yeah, but in terms of thinking that it's true and will ultimately happen, I think
I do think it's true. Yeah, I'm with DBH on this. Yeah, for better or worse. I hope 80% of the readership hasn't just signed off.
No, universalism is making a comeback.
It really does change your outlook on non-Christians.
Exactly. We were also talking about this the other day too.
It really does. It really does. And you can graciously and charitably now just say that God is at work there in ways that sometimes embarrass you. It's so profound. But you're not letting go of the fact that Jesus is the key. Jesus is the key. He is the insight. What's the point of becoming a Christian if everybody gets saved? Well, you weren't supposed to become a Christian just so that you could get saved in the first place. It's not fire insurance, right?
Yeah.
John, you didn't just marry Laura because she's incredibly wealthy heiress, or did you?
I mean,
yeah.
Can we talk about this later?
You would have married her if she was a penniless person.
That's right.
Yeah, because you love her and want to be with her right now, and she has a wonderful plan for your life. Right. This is why we relate to Jesus. Yeah.
This was our Douglas was our wedding officiant, so he's giving us some marriage counseling at the moment. Just a couple more. From Shusa, do you think injecting the prison system with religious teachings, for example, Christian in the US, is a good thing? I'm curious about the impact of these policies.
That's what you mean by Christianity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely understanding this. I do know that in the federal system there are chaplains, and most of them are Christians, but they have to be open to teach all religious traditions.
Yeah, you kind of have to be. It's pluralism, essentially, right?
Yeah. In terms of having a prison system with good people, this is a controversial point. I think the chaplains actually are really, really important. It's a very difficult role to play. But I do think having an authentic Christian gospel involved with as many things as possible is always a good thing.
Yeah.
I wouldn't back off from that. I'd love to see authentic gospel having an impact on the prison system, the justice system, the police system, the reentry system, the political system. I'd love to see all of those being remade in the image of Christ much more effectively. So yeah, I think you're going in exactly the right direction. I would be really, really radical about that.
Right. All right. I don't think we have any more for you, but I want to be respectful of your time. So we're going to wrap things up. Thank you so much, Douglas, for being on with us. And,
thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Yeah, for sharing your knowledge on both Paul and prisons and the connection between those. Yeah. Do you have any?
I really don't. No, this has been a
anything?
good conversation, and I think we hit some really good theological points. And that's good work.
Yeah, spread the word, everybody.
Spread the word. Listen to the videos.
And God's nice too.
That's right. Yeah. So thank you everyone for joining us for this live stream with Douglas Campbell. Please like and subscribe to our channel. And with that, this has been Apocalypse Here, Christianity You Can Live With. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.